Hi guy, welcome back TV spoilers. Sienna Bacall appeared in front of Victor Newman like a fresh tear in a curtain already shredded by secrets. She had just escaped Matt Clark, and she carried danger on her skin the way smoke clings after a fire sharp, inescapable, and chilling enough to make every breath feel like a gamble. What seized Victor's attention wasn't only Sienna's survival. It was the look in her eyes, the look of someone who had stared straight at a predator and understood that Matt was not the kind of enemy you could manage with threats or temporary compromises. She didn't come to plead. She didn't come to be comforted. She came like a key slid into the exact lock Victor needed opened. And the moment she revealed that Nick had Matt unconscious in the trunk of his car, Victor's iron control snapped into something far more dangerous than anger became a storm. Victor wasn't furious because Nick had acted recklessly. Recklessness was practically a language the Newman men had learned in childhood. Victor was furious because Nick had acted alone, behind his back, as if Nick believed he could reshape a war that belonged in the hands of the one man who understood the battlefield best. In Victor's mind, Matt wasn't merely a personal threat. Matt was a ticking bomb that could destroy reputations, careers, relationships, and most importantly, that fragile illusion of safety the Newman family kept trying to stitch back together. Victor had lived long enough to know that men like Matt didn't fear warnings, didn't fear the law, and certainly didn't fear family loyalty. Matt feared only one thing: losing control. And right now, control was sitting in Nick's handstick. The son who had always been willing to cross a line without looking back, because in his heart, fear often wore the mask of responsibility. Victor didn't hesitate. He chose the most direct response, the one he always used when a mistake threatened to metastasize into catastrophe. He confronted Nick not as a worried father, but as a leader who had been undermined by his closest ally. The silence between them was so heavy it felt like the air itself was choking, and every second that passed carried the weight of accusation. Victor looked at Nick with the eyes of a man who had watched families break apart because of emotional decisions, and he recognized the bitter truth. Nick hadn't hidden Matt to protect Victor. He had hidden Matt to prove he could stand alone against the storm. Nick wasn't only fighting Matt. Nick was fighting his father's shadow. Nick didn't back down easily. He defended his choice with the stubbornness that had always defined him, but beneath that stubbornness was something more fragile and more humane, a fear he couldn't name out loud. Keeping Matt in the trunk sounded insane, but in Nick's logic, it was the only way to delay something worse. Matt unconscious meant he couldn't strike in that moment. Matt silent meant the Newman family still had a few minutes to breathe. Nick convinced himself he was controlling the situation, that he was buying time to find the cleanest solution possible. But what Nick wouldn't admit, what he wouldn't allow himself to face, was that he was terrified of what would happen if he handed Matt over to Victor. Nick knew Victor too well. Victor wouldn't just neutralize Matt. Victor would erase him permanently, efficiently, and in ways the law would never touch. Only Victor Newman would dare to do it. That was why this confrontation wasn't only about an enemy in a trunk. It was a battle between two moral worlds. Victor spoke with the cold certainty of experience, pressing the fact that Matt was a serious threat and reminding Nick that the family had already paid too much for hesitation. Victor didn't need Nick's emotional agreement. He needed strategic obedience. In Victor's mind, it was simple. As long as Matt existed, the danger existed. And danger to the Newman family was not something Victor allowed to linger. He refused to compromise because he believed he was right, but also because Nick was trying to pull him into a spiral Victor dispersed, a spiral where Nick decided, controlled, and gambled the entire family's safety on impulsive confidence. Nick reacted like a man backed into a corner. He didn't want to admit he was wrong, but he also didn't want to be the one who opened the door for Victor to do something irreversible. There was exhaustion in Nick's eyes, exhaustion of someone who had tried to hold everything in his hands until his fingers bled. He didn't deny Matt was dangerous. He didn't deny the family could be destroyed. But Nick still wanted to believe there was a right solution that didn't require turning into Victor's colder, darker version. That insistence wasn't only pride. It was the desperate belief that if Nick surrendered Matt to Victor, he would spend the rest of his life haunted by the feeling that he chose the easiest path, handing responsibility to someone else and washing his hands of the consequences. Victor wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to end the argument with power. He asserted his experience dealing with enemies like Matt, reminding Nick that predators never retreat because someone asks them to. Matt could only be stopped, or he would return even stronger. Victor locked eyes with Nick as if he wanted to strip away every defense and reach the core truth. And Newman could not afford softness when the family was under threat. Victor declared that only he could eliminate Matt permanently and guarantee absolute safety. The word permanently dropped between them like a hammer. Nick heard it, and something tightened in his chestnut. Fear of Matt, but fear of what Victor might do. The ultimatum came fast and sharp. Victor demanded Nick cooperate or Victor would take control of Matt himself. It wasn't just a threat. It was a reminder that Victor Newman had never accepted being pushed out of the game, especially when the game involved his family's survival. Nick was forced to face the truth. He could keep resisting and turn this crisis into an internal war, or he could surrender and live with the outcome even if that outcome would haunt him forever. Nick's reluctant surrender wasn't weakness. It was a sacrifice. The moment he gave up a piece of his faith to prevent something even worse. He yielded, but he wasn't at peace. It felt like he had just placed a knife into the hands of a man who never hesitated to use it. The second Nick stepped back, Victor moved like a machine built for war. He ordered Matt transferred to a secret location and prepared a private plan to deal with him. Everything happened quickly, cleanly, without emotion. And it was that very coldness that unsettled Nick the most. Nick saw something dangerous in Victor's calm, not of a man wrestling with morality, but of a man cleaning up a threat. To Victor, Matt was toxic waste that needed disposal. To Nick, even Matt was still a living line that Nick feared crossing. But Nick had already taken that step, and he wasn't sure he could ever return. Sienna, even though she delivered the information, didn't feel victorious. She stood outside the confrontation like a witness watching a family rip itself apart for the same purpose. She understood Victor trusted no one but himself, and choosing to tell him the truth was its own gamble. She knew Nick would hate her for cornering him into conflict. She also knew Victor would never treat her as a lasting ally. But she did it anyway, because Matt was her nightmare, and she couldn't survive another day knowing he still had the chance to rise again. Deep down, she didn't believe in Nick's clean solution. She believed in Victor's finality, even if it carried the scent of blood. When Victor took control of Matt, the father-son bond between Victor and Nick entered a new territory of turbulence. This wasn't an argument about business or romance anymore. This was about how a man chooses to exist. Victor believed protecting the family was sacred, and sometimes that sacred duty justified acts others would never dare. Nick believed protecting the family could not become an excuse to lose the part of himself that was still human. But when men like Matt threatened the Newmans, ideals and reality collided like stones, and what shattered wasn't just belief, it was the fragile closeness they had spent years trying to rebuild. While Victor decided Matt's fate, another storm quietly gathered on the other side of their lives. Chelsea Lawson stepped forward with evidence, as if she held a piece of the puzzle no one else could ignore. She didn't have to explain it for it to apply pressure. The fact that she chose to reveal it was proof enough that something was being dragged out of the shadows. Chelsea wasn't doing it to cause chaos. She did it because she'd learned too well that silence was never neutral, it was dangerous. For Chelsea, truth, no matter how painful, was the only way to seize control of the future. But in Genoa City, truth rarely set people free. It usually only changed who was bound. At the same time, Victoria Newman turned her sharp focus toward Billy Abbott. She didn't criticize Billy as a bitter ex-wife. She criticized him as someone who had witnessed too many of his impulsive choices and knew that every opportunity could become a trap if he walked into it blind. Victoria received updates about the Treasury Secretary offer that Kane had presented to Billy, and her instincts went on high alert. Because in Victoria's world, big offers always came with a cost. Billy wanted the opportunity badly, not only because of the job itself, but because of what it represented valuation. Billy wanted to prove he could do something meaningful, that he could hold power, that he could stand on the same level as the people who had spent years treating him like a failure. But Victoria understood that hunger was exactly Billy's greatest weakness. He wanted to prove too much, and that made him easy to manipulate. The tension between Victoria and Billy wasn't about the offer on paper. It was about the fear Victoria rarely admitted out loud that Billy was being pulled into a political and power-driven game he wasn't called enough to survive. She didn't need conspiracy theories to feel the danger. The timing alone was suspicious, as if someone had studied Billy's flaws and chosen the perfect moment to cast a golden rope over his shoulders. If Billy accepted, he wouldn't only carry his ambition into the situation. He would carry risk that could ripple into Newman territory in ways no one could predict. Victoria criticized him because she could see him standing at the crossroads he always reached. Either he truly grew up, or he repeated his mistakes in a new, more catastrophic form. Billy, like Nick, was the kind of man who believed determination could control any outcome. He was addicted to the respect the offer promised, the intoxicating feeling of not being treated as a backup plan or a reckless child. But the problem was the offer arrived too perfectly, as if it wasn't a gift at all but a hook. Billy wanted to believe in the best version of the story, but everyone around him who understood power could see the cliff edge. Sally had already warned Billy, making it clear she was unhappy. Her warning wasn't jealousy. It wasn't control. It was the alarm of someone who knew Billy's patterns too well, how he self-destructed the moment he believed he was about to win. Sally saw Billy getting swept away by the dream of being recognized, and she feared that dream would blind him to every warning sign. But if Sally was the softer warning, Victoria was the harsh reality. She became the next voice pushing back, and her pressure didn't just irritate Billy, it made him feel insulted. Because Billy hated being treated like someone who needed to be managed. Yet that very reaction was proof Victoria was right. Billy was answering with ego, not strategy. All of these tensions met in the trunk, Victor taking control, Nick surrendering reluctantly, Chelsea presenting evidence, Victoria confronting Billy, Kane hovering behind the Treasury offer, Sally warning from a place of fear didn't exist separately. They were threads tightening around the same knot. The Newmans and the people tangled around them were stepping into a phase where every decision could shift the balance of power. And the most terrifying part was that no one truly knew what they were facing. Matt was a visible threat, yes, but internal fractures, eroding trust, and offers that looked too tempting were invisible threats, kind that destroyed families from the inside. Nick walked away from Victor feeling half relieved and half sick with dread. He knew he had avoided a direct war with his father, but he also knew he had handed the final decision to a man who never accepted losing. Nick couldn't stop seeing Matt unconscious, an enemy silent for now, but not necessarily finished. And somewhere inside him, Nick sensed he had just opened the door to something worse. If Victor handled Matt in his own way, would Nick ever see his father the same again? Or would he live with the truth that to protect his family, he had chosen to stand beside the darkness? Victor, meanwhile, moved with cold certainty. He believed he was doing what needed to be done. Yet even Victor wasn't immune to the crack that had formed between him and Nick. Nick's resistance reminded Victor that power could not replace trust, and if Victor kept forcing obedience, he might win the war against Matt but lose the deeper war with his son. Still, Victor chose the path he always chose. Prioritize absolute safety over emotion. Feelings could be repaired later, he told himself. Death could not. Chelsea held her evidence like a small flaminif to expose the shadows, enough to burn everything down if the wine caught it. She understood that once the truth was revealed, no one could pretend anymore. And in Genoa City, where every secret carried a price tag, truth was often the most dangerous weapon of all. Victoria looked at Billy with eyes that were both sharp and tired. She didn't want to be the one who always warned him, but she also couldn't sit back and watch him walk into a gamble disguised as a golden opportunity. Her anger wasn't only frustration. It was proof she still cared enough to feel it. Billy, in return, was torn between desire and suspicion. He wanted to prove himself, to rise beyond the legacy of failure. But the more he was challenged, the more determined he became, like resistance was fuel for a fire that could destroy him. And then, just when things seemed briefly contained, the tension rose again in a quieter, more terrifying way. Victor had taken Matt. But Matt wasn't the kind of enemy you could simply move like cargo. Matt was chaos in human form, the kind that could wake at any moment or worse, the kind that might have planned his next move even while unconscious. Nick couldn't shake that thought, replaying it like a nightmare. Sienna understood she had triggered a chain reaction no one could fully control. At the same time, Billy still stood in front of Kane's offer like a man staring through an open door that promised power, while hiding an abyss on the other side. Victoria had spoken. Sally had warned. And Billy, no matter how steady he tried to appear, began to feel pressure tightening around his throat like an invisible noose. If he stepped forward and failed, he would lose everything. If he didn't step forward, he would condemn himself as a coward. That conflict made him more vulnerable than ever. Every thread pulled tighter toward the same point. Control was slipping, and everyone was fighting to grab it in their own way. Victor used authority. Nick used reckless courage. Chelsea used truth. Victoria used logic. Billy used ambition. Sally used fear. Kane used an offer like bait. And at the center of it all, Matt Clark, unconscious but still powerful, was the shadow that made them move as if they were being hunted. The most terrifying part was that none of them knew who would pay first. But the moment Victor gave the order to transfer Matt to a secret location, a cold instinct crawled up Nick's spine, like he had just heard a door lock shut behind him. Nick understood that from this second on, nothing belonged to him anymore. And if Victor had truly decided Matt's fate in the only way Victor believed in, then the fallout wouldn't stop with Matt, it would spill into the Newman family itself. Because a new secret was about to be born, only so dark that even Nick wasn't sure he could survive the day the truth finally surfaced. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.